Thanks everybody for joining us this morning. As I think some of you who've been involved in events like this before know this is one of our more ambitious attempts to Zoom this number of people together. We had a good old test at the Big Yellow Party, which I hope some of you joined in, which was great fun a couple of weeks ago. But we thought it was timely to have a broader session, obviously principally to talk about what we now need to refer to as Kaftrio, which I think will take a little bit of adjusting for all of us. And so I'm going to speak, and I know some of you very well, but I'm David, I'm the Chief Executive of the Trust, and also joining to speak in a moment will be Dr Keith Brownlee, who's our Director of Policy Programmes of Support, which I know many of you are familiar with. I have to do, even in a virtual meeting, a couple of housekeeping things. Please do keep your cameras off and microphones muted most of the time, please. If you do want to raise a question, do use the chat box, which you can see we're already, people are posting in there. We've obviously also, thanks to many of you, had pre-submitted questions, and we've got the four most prominent ones of those that we'll respond to as part of what we're going to talk you through in the next 35 minutes or so. And I saw one of the questions just went out as well. Yes, we are recording this in the hope that we can make sure that it reaches the widest possible audience, because we hope that the content is useful. What we know and what we've still got to find out in the coming weeks and months. But firstly, the headline I wanted to start with is what we're going to be talking through, which is where are we now and where are we going? Talk a little bit about the EMA license and the NHS England deal, reflecting on the campaign and looking beyond England. And then Keith, who will introduce himself and his background, will talk about what we know about Kaftrio, who will benefit from the current deal, and what the studies suggest. And then also, and critically, the fact that we're not stopping, and we've got to make sure that we carry on until the most effective treatments are available to all people, the whole population of people with cystic fibrosis in these islands. We've got a little space for Q&A, and then I'll do a little bit of wrap up. So if I can talk a little bit about this strange period that we've been through, which is firstly to say, we're very conscious, and many of you will be right at the forefront of what's been a really difficult few months. And I'm not talking about access to drugs. I'm talking about the pandemic, and we know that the challenges that many of you have lived with day in, day out. And I hope, and I'm proud that the Trust has worked really hard to support people, and we know that that battle goes on in the coming weeks and months, particularly as we move through different phases of the crisis over the coming months. We're really working really hard to advocate, and you will have seen that across the four nations, and to make sure that the support is in place where it needs to be. Alongside that, we really wanted, and I think celebrate, I'm always a little bashful about using the word celebrate, but we should truly celebrate what's happened over the last few weeks in terms of access to medicines. We've seen the licensing of the triple through the EMA getting very close, and we'll talk about that in a little moment. And we've also seen the announcement of the first deal in the islands with the NHS England deal, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But what I really wanted to emphasize is my deep gratitude to every one of you and the entire cystic fibrosis community, and all our fellow travellers who came together to make what has happened, because I've no doubt that the energy and the voice that was displayed right across the UK was a fundamental part of knowing of the politicians and the policymakers and the drug company, knowing that we would not go away until there were deals in place that ensured that people who could get access did get access to the drugs that would have such a significant impact. So reflecting on where we are at, on 26th of June, we heard from a body that works within the EMA that they confirmed that they'd found the drug to be safe and effective, and that it would now move forward to receive its license. We also, as I was just alluding to, we found out that it had its new name, which still doesn't really trip off the tongue, I have to say, but I really don't care. But it is really important to stress a couple of things at this point. One is that at this point, what the body of the AMA, the actual CHMP as it's called, it has made a recommendation. The license has not formally been issued. In their guidelines, they talk about that being done within 67 days. Very interesting number, but within 67 days of the recommendation. So we expect that the license will be formally confirmed. We're probably looking at the back end of August. Or, however, it's worth saying it could come sooner. But we don't know, and actually speaking to others close to the situation, we don't expect to get much advance notice. So we might actually get some really great news very soon, as in weeks, rather than having to wait the full 50-something days that are still on that clock. But it's important to recognize that part of the formal process to getting the license has not yet been completed. And that becomes very important when we talk a little later about where we think the deal sits and what's covered. And I know that's right at the forefront of many of your minds. There's some ambiguity there, and Keith will talk to that. We're really pleased because, when we started this process, I was talking to my team a lot about we really didn't know if it was going to take 2 months or 2 years. We thought particularly with the NICE timeline, there was a phase where we very much thought that might be towards the end of this year before we had really positive steps forward. And it's a real tribute to your efforts and the efforts that have been going on by many parties that we've been able to expedite that process. And as you will have picked up, we've been working with our fellow organisations across Europe on the EMA process to make sure that expediting the process was critical. And also, we wrote and have been lobbying to the Chief Executive of Vertex and the Secretary of State and relevant peers across the nations to say, look, at a time of crisis like COVID, it's really important that the best possible medicines are available. So thank you to all your support in bringing that forward. So moving to the England deal, what we know is that last Tuesday, it was announced by Simon Stevens at the Health and Social Care Committee. And that was a really nice moment because that was a continuation that many of you will remember of the Health and Social Care Committee inquiry that we all worked collectively to promote. And, every one of you who submitted evidence to that should know that that was also a critical part in raising the profile and the agenda of this topic. But we know that it's I would say a pretty comprehensive deal. It has criteria in it for expansion of the license when that's formally approved, when the EMA goes through the next process of licensing for different age groups, etc. And we know, and as Keith will talk to, this is about the eligibility criteria of people with 2 copies of F508 or 1 F508 and minimal function. I'll leave Keith to give them more specialist guidance on that. The other element in there was the tag-along rights, as they were termed, but being very clear that when NHS England were having conversations, they were having them in the full knowledge and with the support of the devolved administrations. And I wanted to absolutely emphasize that we won't stop until the drugs are available to all, but at this particular critical time, there's a real intensity of effort to make sure that by the time we reach the licensing, which will be in 50-something days, that there are arrangements in place in the 4 nations of the UK and the Channel Islands and the Isle of Man to ensure that people can make rapid access and actually the clinicians can start prescribing. I also wanted to say just a couple of comments on how we got here, and I've alluded to some of it, but I, as you might imagine, spend quite a bit of time with charities who are in similar space to us, and they have been, I think, in awe of how the community has worked, and actually the deliberate persistence over, tragically over many years for Orkambi and then Simkevi, which and the ceaseless energy that's been displayed by many of you, well, all of you on this call and many thousands of others to get us, for the various tactics that were deployed. I won't single any one person out, because actually the reality is this was a concerted, coordinated, comprehensive campaign that was putting pressure on all the relevant parties. And I hope that everyone is proud that we've reached this moment now, but we know we need to kick on, and there's more to do. So I absolutely want to make it clear that we're not resting on our laurels in terms of getting across the nations. We're also not resting on our laurels in terms of recognizing that we need to get these drugs, practically get them to as many people as possible, as quickly as possible, and also ensure that we do not forget about those people for who these drugs will not be relevant. And Keith's going to talk a little bit to that. So I'll hand over to Keith now, if you'd like to take the microphone, Keith.
Thanks, David. And hello, everyone. And can I reiterate what David said, and thank you all for joining this event. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Keith Brownlee. I'm, as David said, a director at the Cystic Fibrosis Trust, a director of policy, programs and support, and I've worked with the Trust for about 5 years. Prior to that, I worked in Leeds as a paediatrician caring for children and families with cystic fibrosis for about 30 years in total. And that was a great privilege. And I must say, this is a fantastic moment in CF that this medication is going to be made available for many, many people and many families. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the background, benefits and eligibility of Kaftrio. Now, I want to be absolutely upfront at the beginning and make it very clear that there's still some uncertainty or ambiguity around exactly who this pertains to. First of all, there's two parallel processes. The first process David has talked to, and that's the EMA and their recommendation to the European Commission to grant a license for this medication for people with 2 508 mutations and for 1 508 mutation plus a minimal function mutation. Now, a minimal function mutation has been defined as those kind of mutations that don't produce any of the CFTR protein or don't respond in a test tube in vitro to currently available modulators. Now, that's where one of the problems is, because the list of minimal function mutations is still being worked on. It's still being compiled by the European Commission. And until that list is finalized, we can't give certainty about who this will actually pertain to. However, we have been reassured by Vertex and others that it will be a very broad list, certainly more inclusive than the list of minimal function mutations that were in the trials that I'll talk about in a few moments. The other process that's ongoing, and again David has referred to this, is the NHS England commissioning process. So once NHS England decided that they were happy to pay for this medication, they had to write a commissioning policy to who would benefit from it. Now, there's still a little bit of uncertainty around that because it's still being written. But basically, Simon Stevens and John Stewart in his letter referred to making Vertex drugs available for certain patients with rare mutations that are covered by the US Food and Drug Administration FDA license. Now, again, that's being written, so we're not entirely sure we know which mutations that relates to. But again, hopefully, and we're certainly advocating this and working behind the scenes with all of the relevant parties, that will be a very inclusive list going forward. And we have been reassured that if you are likely to benefit from a highly effective modulator, then hopefully you will have access to that. Right, can I move on to the next slide, please? I want to, I think it's a fantastic moment, as I've already said, and I know many of you will have talked to friends and contacts who've actually had access to Kaftrio. We know from Vertex that there's over 400 people in the UK who are currently receiving Kaftrio, either from on a compassionate use program or as a rollover from one of the trials and other trials that I'm not going to talk about. And many of those people have written blogs or talked about their experiences and have given very, very positive reports. But we thought that this would be a really useful moment to go through some of the trials that led to the EMA licensing decision. And that's what I intend to do now. So bear with me. The first trial I want to talk about was published at the end of last year in November 2019 in the New England Journal of Medicine, and the main author was Peter Middleton from Australia. And this is a pivotal study. It involved 405 people with CF in many countries around the world, and it involved people who had a 508 mutation and a minimal function mutation. There was about 200 people received the treatment, so Kaftrio or elexacaftor, tezacaftor and ivacaftor, and another 200 or so people who received a placebo. Can we move on to the next slide, please? Now this is staggering. This graph represents the lung function change as a result of Kaftrio. As you can see, in the blue line is the treatment and the grey line is the placebo. And on the horizontal or the x-axis, we've got time. So this was a 24-week study. And on the y-axis, we've got absolute change from baseline of the percent predicted FEV1. So to put that into some kind of context, Orkambi or Symkevi results in approximately 2.6 to 4% improvement in FEV1. Whereas the triple, the blue line, elexacaftor, tezacaftor, ivacaftor, resulted in a 13 to 14% improvement in FEV1 over and above the placebo, which is staggering improvement. And as you can see, that was sustained throughout the duration of the study. Next slide, please. Now, as in any drug, there's a range of response to that drug. And this slide tries to illustrate that range in response. Again, the gray is the placebo and the blue is the treatment. And you can see there's a clear distinction between the two. The blue have a significant improvement in their FEV1 through to 24 weeks. You can see at the far end, a small number had an over 30% improvement in FEV1. But the vast majority of people who started on this treatment had an improvement in FEV1. And that's just not the case for most drugs. There's normally a much greater overlap than this slide shows. And you have to remember that there may be reasons why people didn't improve, such as they may have acquired a concomitant exacerbation or a viral infection or whatever. But the point being here, it can be expected that most people will improve with this treatment. And some of those improvements are very significant. Next slide, please. The other thing that's really important is exacerbations or flare-ups in infections. And again, you will be aware that Orkambi and Symkevi resulted in a reduction in the number of flare-ups by about 40%. But in this study, the reduction in exacerbations was 63% for those people taking Trikafta. And even more impressively, if you actually look at what happened in terms of hospitalizations and the need for treating an exacerbation with intravenous antibiotics, there was a far greater reduction in the need for intervention. Next slide, please. We also know from that study, which I should have mentioned before we move to this slide, but there was an improvement in BMI of about 1, and there was a significant improvement in quality of life as well. And I know one of the questions that somebody submitted was about other symptoms, and we'll come to that later on after I've talked about these studies. The second study that I'd like to talk about, that study addresses those who have a 508 and a minimal function mutation. This study addresses the other important group, which is those who have 2 508 mutations. And this study was published in The Lancet in October of last year. And this was a really important study, but it was only relatively short at 28 days. And it involved randomizing a relatively small number of people, about 100 or so, to either receive Trikafta or Kaftrio, or essentially Symkevi. Next slide, please. And again, you can see on this slide that there was a significant improvement in FEV1, as indicated by the blue line, as compared in the treatment arm, those who received Trikafta or Kaftrio, as compared to those who received Symkevi. So that improvement over the duration of the study was about 10%. So over and above the benefit of Symkevi, these people, by adding in the elexacaftor, had an additional improvement of around 10%. And again, that's a very significant improvement, as I'm sure virtually everybody on this call is fully aware of. Next slide, please. I included this because I think this really gets to the crux of all of this. Again, I'm sure everybody on this call is very familiar with the sweat test. The sweat test, as you know, is a test that we use to diagnose cystic fibrosis. And basically, it detects that the sweat is more salty than it should be. And that's the basic fundamental physiological problem. And if you're taking Trikafta or Kaftrio, you can see from this study that a sweat test went from being highly abnormal, about 90 millimoles, anything above 60 millimoles is abnormal and positive for cystic fibrosis, to being in the normal range, i.e. below 60 millimoles. So you can see here on the blue line, these people with cystic fibrosis were given the triple combination, and the sweat tests returned into the normal range. Now that clearly doesn't mean they no longer have cystic fibrosis, but it's a very clear indication that the basic physiological abnormality of cystic fibrosis is being corrected by this compound. Next slide, please. I also wanted to include this because I think quality of life is really important. And we know from individuals that even some of those who didn't have a very marked improvement in FEV1 still felt far better and felt different and had less in the way of symptoms. And this is a slide indicating the impact on the quality of life score, the CFQR, and particularly the respiratory domain. So it's about respiratory symptoms. And again, you can see that the Symkevi group, the red groups, remained roughly consistent throughout the 4 weeks duration of the study, whereas the treatment arm, the Kaftrio arm, showed a consistent improvement of about 16 points, about 17 points over and above Symkevi. Now, any improvement of 4 is clinically significant. So this shows a substantial improvement in symptoms. Having said that, I think, again, many of you will know from social media and from talking to people that when people start the triple combination, they often have what they refer to as the purge. And that means that cough actually increases very significantly. And there's literally a period of clearing secretions that have been entrenched perhaps for a long time before those secretions are cleared. So there may be a worsening of symptoms before there's an improvement in symptoms, as indicated by this graph. The other thing I'd like to say is that these are remarkably safe medications. The number of people who actually dropped out of the trials because of side effects were very small, and it was 1% in the Middleton paper. And I don't think anybody dropped out of this trial. And the side effect profiles are very safe. We're talking about rashes and some other minor changes in the majority of patients. Next slide, please. So I've talked a bit about eligibility, and I've talked a little bit about the expected benefits from these medications. We all know, and we at the Trust are all very aware, that these medications won't benefit everybody. And there's a variety of different reasons for that. Some people will not have a 508 mutation, and it's very clear that Kaftrio works on the 508 mutation. Some people may not benefit for other reasons, and obviously people post-transplant at the moment can't have access to these treatments because of potential impact on the immunosuppressive therapy. But we are very aware of that, and we're absolutely determined not to leave that group behind. You know, things that we support in terms of ensuring traditional care and treatment continues to improve, will continue. And there are many, many examples of that. And there's no doubt improvements in quality of life and life expectancy will continue for all, and particularly for that 10%. We're continuing to invest in research into new treatments for everyone with CF, including gene therapy, which potentially could be mutation agnostic, but also for treating lung infections. And we're specifically targeting finding new treatments for those who don't currently benefit from existing modulators. And very importantly, our clinical trials accelerator program, which is there to facilitate the process of clinical trials in the UK, will continue. And as I mentioned earlier, some 400 people have already got access to treatments prior to licensing through clinical trials, and that will continue as well, with a whole pipeline of other treatments coming down in due course. Next slide, please. Okay, I perhaps rushed through that a little bit. I don't know where we are with timing.
No, we're good, Keith. I think we've run for about 25 minutes, but we're going to run for a few more minutes to answer some of the questions that have come in. But thanks for that. And I was also say, for the people who are putting questions in the notes, we're definitely capturing those. I also think some of them will be addressed in a few of the questions that we've had in advance. So I'll pose the first one to myself, which is where are we with access in the devolved nations? Which I think I covered a little bit in my earlier comments, but I just want to emphasize, yes, we will have seen, and there's been correspondence from and press statements from various parts of the UK, and I think there's a dynamic process in place where there are clearly seems to be an aspiration that everybody will be lined up by the time the license is granted. That's not straightforward because we are dealing with different administrations, but we are not going to lose focus on making sure, and I know there's many of you doing the same in your nation, to ensure that we get to that point where by the time it reaches the licensing stage that we can move with the practicalities of getting the drugs out as quickly as possible. The second question, which is I think very relevant, is, and I'll ask you, Keith, is what's going on with the 6 to 11-year-olds in terms of license extension?
Yeah, sure. Clearly, these drugs are likely to work very well in children in holding them well with undamaged lungs, and we are very aware of that. But they do have to be proven in clinical trials to be safe and effective for children. And we are very aware that there are phase 3 clinical trials at different stages in the process for the 6 to 11-year age group. You know, our clinical trials accelerator program and the UK arm of the trials tracker includes some of those. We have talked to Vertex about when they think the drugs will be available for children, and they weren't prepared to commit. We do believe that they are likely to submit a extension application to the FDA for the 6 to 11-year age group later this year. And we believe that they will follow that on with a regulatory submission to the EMA, and perhaps a decision being made by 2021. So we're looking at some point next year for the 6 to 11-year age group. And if that does transpire to be the case, then that will be quicker than has occurred with the other modulator preparations. And we've got our fingers crossed with regard to that. At the moment, there aren't trials for 2 to 5-year age group, but I do believe those trials are in the planning stage.
Thank you. I think it's also just worth adding a codicil to that, which many of you be obviously we're conscious that we're also waiting on 6 to 11 for Simkevi, which we would hope would be towards the end of this year. is the latest information we've got. The next question, Keith, is one for you. It seems to be the one that's raised a lot of the questions in the chat during the meeting, which is, do we have any evidence, research-based or anecdotal, about Kaftrio helping other CF problems, gut, diabetes, fertility, etc.?
That's a really, really important question. And I hope you will have seen that the studies that I talked about are relatively short, 4 weeks and 24 weeks. But what I didn't say is that patients enrolled in those studies will be offered to roll over into an extension of about 96 weeks where more data will be collected. The other important point with regard to that, I think I really need to emphasize that it is unlikely that these drugs will actually reverse structural damage. So if people with CF have had damage to their airway as a result of chronic inflammation and chronic infection, then that damage, the bronchiectasis as it is called, is unlikely to be reversed. However, people are optimistic that these drugs will have other impacts. There's certainly evidence, good evidence, that they can have a really important impact on sinusitis. And there's reports of people having complete clearing of the sinuses on starting these treatments. There's also belief that they may have an impact on diabetes in some patients because of a reduction of the metabolic demand of cystic fibrosis. There's hope that they will have an impact on chronic infection, certainly in the prevention of establishment of chronic infection, and perhaps less so in terms of clearing chronic infection that's been established. In terms of fertility, I don't know about female fertility for obvious reasons, but in terms of male fertility, they're unlikely to have an impact because the fundamental problem there is a failure of development of the vas deferens, a tube, and that's unlikely to be corrected by these drugs. We also know that they improve BMI, and there's some reports of significant improvement in GI symptoms as well. So the answer to that is a bit mixed, but overall, many things will improve.
Thanks, Keith. And the final pre-submitted question, which is, I think, probably very pertinent, which is there enough stock? How will it work with home delivery? Where are we going in terms of actually mindful that we had we have more warning in some ways than we did last time to get this going in terms of effective implementation of actually the drugs being available?
Yeah, we've been in touch with Vertex about this, and we've talked to the key people in Vertex about this, and they are very optimistic. They are working hard at this point in time to make sure that they get the logistics right, that they get more than enough stock in place, that they work with centres for making sure that this can be rolled out as quickly as possible. They made the very valid point that the recent rollout of Orkambi and Symkevi has actually put centres in a very strong position for actually sort of continuing that process and getting this rolled out as quickly as possible after the drug has been officially licensed and the commissioning policy in England has been completed and written, which we are hopeful will be roughly at the same time. So as David mentioned earlier, at some point within 66 days from the EMA announcement, so towards the end of August. At some point, it could be earlier than that, but some point before the end of August. I would also say that I know this hasn't been the case for all centres, but the uptake of Symkevi in the UK from the Vertex's perspective has been far, far more efficient and rapid than any other country.
Thanks, Keith. I'm just reflecting on some of the questions that have come in. I think just answering a couple of them, and then I'll do post any others. We have a couple of minutes or so for final questions. One is, I think on the 6 to 11-year-olds, my understanding that it is not currently available because of the FDA application that we talked about earlier. I think as well, and I share the frustration about the knowledge about which minimal functions and in fact which genotypes are going to be covered ultimately. And as Keith said earlier, we're working really hard to actually establish that list, because it is still a work in progress, but clearly we will communicate that and lobby as hard for that to be as permissive and wide as possible as soon as that is possible. There's a question there on the HIT-CF data. Where is that with the data at the moment, Keith? Do you know?
The Trust is actually supporting HIT-CF. We've provided funds to ensure that Nick Simmons at the Brompton could facilitate as many people with CF who may benefit from that in the UK to get access to that. But it's an important point. It's about the rarer mutations, and it's a means of trying to establish which modulators will benefit people with the rarest mutations. And they're collecting the material at the moment.
I think there's also
will be involved in that as well.
Yeah, I'm just commenting, looking at some of the comments coming in as well. I think there's a very good one there. Yes, we will absolutely clarify where and make a very clear distinction between people that we don't think can medically benefit and those that could medically benefit who are being not able to access the drugs. That's a fundamental point that, of course, we'll be advocating strongly on, as well as doing all we can to bring forward the research in the other areas to make as many genotype agnostic and other therapies available to those who can't benefit from these drugs for medical rather than policy reasons, if I can put it like that. And there's a question, my assumption about compassionate access, I would assume that we are still in the same situation. Please correct me if I'm wrong in terms of that. That scheme exists until it doesn't exist.
It hasn't been closed yet, no.
Yeah. Okay. I'm going to wrap up now because I know we've run a little over time, but I know there's we will capture everything that has been recorded on here and make sure that we continue to post as much information as we can. And please do continue to come in with your queries. It looks like Keith has one question he wants to answer.
No, yeah, quite a few people have asked about other treatments. And this is really, really important because we are very conscious indeed that people with CF have a massive burden of additional treatments. And that's something that we want to investigate. And we are supporting a group of clinicians, including Kevin Southern and Stuart Elborn and others, to try to get a study underway to discover what treatments could be safely stopped once people are on highly effective modulators. And in the first instance, they will be looking at nebulized mucolytics, but that study is seeking funding at the moment.
Thanks, Keith. I'm going to wrap up by saying, look, we've put on our slide there our campaign newsletter. We intend to hold more of these, particularly, as this one seems to have technologically worked, which has given us some confidence to keep going. But we're going to have these at regular intervals. We want, we'll want to keep across all the work we're doing, but also critically take your feedback, guidance, and advice, and keep you informed of developments as they come along. Do sign up to the campaigning letter, and thanks again. I mean, I just want to reiterate again, I joined the cystic fibrosis community 3.5 years ago, and I'm proud to be part of such an amazing bunch of people who've fought so hard and so effectively. And we know future battles lie ahead, but you should be really proud of having got us to this point. So thank you very much.